Why were these beloved 1950s foods suddenly banned? They once filled family tables before fear and new laws took them away. When did comfort start coming with a warning label? Raw milk was once a kitchen staple in America, poured into breakfast cereal or churned into butter right at home. But by the 1950s, it became a symbol of danger. Public health officials began linking unpasteurized milk to outbreaks of tuberculosis and bacterial infections that terrified entire towns. States started banning it outright, calling it a silent threat that could make families sick without warning. The same families who once relied on farm-fresh milk suddenly had to trust sterilized cartons from factories instead. It was the end of an era where milk came straight from the cow, still warm and frothy. For many, it felt like losing a piece of country honesty to cold machinery and government mandates. Yet the fear was real, and so were the infections. Pasteurization laws were sold as safety measures, but they also reshaped how people viewed food. No longer as a natural gift, but something that had to be controlled and purified. That shift in trust between the farm and the factory quietly changed America's relationship with what it ate forever. Cyclamate sweeteners promised guilt-free sweetness long before diet culture had a name. Housewives sprinkled it into coffee, dieters swore by it, and soda companies celebrated it as the taste of the future. But when lab tests linked cyclamates to cancer in rats, the panic spread faster than the rumors themselves. By the late 1950s, government regulators stepped in, pulling the sweetener from shelves in a sudden sweep that shocked the public. For millions, it was the first time they realized their pantry could be hiding a threat. What was once a symbol of modern convenience became a warning about how far science could go in the name of progress. The ban exposed a growing divide between trust in innovation and fear of what it might cost. The taste of safety turned bitter, and Americans began to question every miracle ingredient that followed. Cyclamate sweeteners faded, but their shadow lingered over every sugar substitute that came after, from saccharin to aspartame. The country learned that even sweetness had consequences. Horsemeat stew was not born from luxury. It was born from survival. During wartime shortages, when beef and pork were rationed beyond reach, horsemeat quietly took their place on American dinner tables. It was cheap, tender, and easy to find in butcher shops trying to meet impossible demands. But by the 1950s, eating horsemeat became unthinkable. The very animal that carried soldiers, pulled plows, and symbolized American endurance had turned into a taboo. Cultural backlash spread through headlines and households alike. Eating a horse was now seen as an act of desperation, not resourcefulness. The meat was pulled from shelves, restaurants scrubbed it from menus, and butchers who sold it were shamed. It was one of the first examples of food politics shaped not by safety or health, but by emotion and morality. The stew that once fed hungry families during hard times suddenly vanished, erased by changing values. In the end, the horse went back to the stable, this time as something sacred. Color-dyed margarine turned into one of the strangest food wars of the 1950s. Dairy farmers saw it as a threat to their livelihood, a cheap imitation stealing butter's golden glow. State after state passed laws banning yellow margarine, forcing companies to sell it as a pale, unappetizing white slab. In some places, you had to mix your own coloring packet at home just to make it look edible. The butter wars became a battle between old-fashioned tradition and modern convenience. Families who couldn't afford butter felt punished for trying to stretch their grocery budgets. Politicians called the dye deceptive. Homemakers called the laws ridiculous. In truth, it was never really about color. It was about control. Food was becoming industrial, and the fight for margarine's hue symbolized something deeper. Who had the right to decide what Americans ate? Eventually, the bans faded, but the lesson lingered. Sometimes, the biggest battles over food have nothing to do with taste at all. Coca-Cola once had a secret ingredient that no one dared talk about: coca leaf extract. For decades, tiny traces of it gave the drink its signature kick, a stimulant wrapped in sweetness. By the 1950s, that secret had become a liability. The Food and Drug Administration began tightening regulations around narcotics and stimulants, forcing Coca-Cola to quietly reformulate without ever admitting what changed. Rumors swirled that the beloved drink was being cleaned up, and fans noticed the taste shift almost overnight. The company insisted nothing had changed, but the ban on coca leaf extracts told a different story. It was part of a broader cultural reckoning with drugs and morality, where pleasure, even in small doses, was treated as a threat. By the end of the decade, Coca-Cola was as American as ever, but its wild edge was gone. The new formula kept people refreshed, but not quite as awake. Home-canned tomatoes and beans were once a homemaker's pride, a shelf lined with jars that meant security through winter. But by the 1950s, those same jars came with warning labels. Botulism outbreaks traced back to kitchen canning terrified families who had relied on the tradition for generations. Health departments launched campaigns against home preservation, urging people to buy store-bought cans instead. It marked the end of a domestic ritual, traded for factory efficiency. Women who once measured their worth by their pantries now felt shame or fear over what might be lurking in their jars. It was not just a public health issue. It was a cultural shift. The kitchen, once the safest room in the house, suddenly seemed like a place where danger could grow unseen. The government called it progress. Homemakers called it a loss. Either way, a century-old skill quietly faded into memory, replaced by the metallic comfort of tin cans. Sassafras tea was once America's forest tonic, brewed from the roots of trees and steeped in stories of old-time healing. Families drank it for colds, stomach aches, or simply for comfort on long winter nights. Then came the 1950s, and with it, science that declared sassafras unsafe. Tests found that saffrole, its key oil, could cause liver damage and cancer in lab animals. Almost overnight, it went from folk remedy to forbidden drink. The government banned it, and families poured out bottles they had once cherished. To some, it felt like losing a piece of tradition, like watching folklore itself get outlawed. But behind the fear was a real truth. Not everything natural is safe. The ban marked one of the first times modern science overruled old wisdom in American kitchens. Even today, the scent of sassafras carries both nostalgia and caution, a reminder that comfort and danger sometimes come from the same cup. Calf brain sandwiches sound unsettling now, but once they were a small-town delicacy. Served hot on toasted buns with onions and mustard, they were a common lunch in diners across the Midwest. Farmers loved them for their price and protein, and few thought twice about it. But by the 1950s, whispers of strange neurological diseases in livestock began circulating. Scientists could not prove much yet, but the fear was enough. Health departments issued warnings, and suddenly, brains on bread vanished from menus almost overnight. Diners stopped serving them, and butchers stopped selling them, more out of caution than law. It was one of the first modern examples of fear outpacing science, shaping what Americans felt safe eating. Those who remembered the sandwiches described them as tender, rich, and oddly comforting. But comfort was no match for paranoia. The calf brain sandwich became a ghost of its own making, proof that appetite can turn to fear faster than any disease can spread. Red dye number 2 was the color of childhood itself. Bright cherry candies, popsicles, and sweet cereals all gleamed with it. Then the headlines came: scientists warning of cancer links, parents panicking, and lawmakers rushing to respond. The once innocent color became a symbol of everything people feared about synthetic additives. Candy factories were forced to reformulate, and grocery shelves turned duller overnight. The ban was more than a regulation. It was an awakening. Americans realized that even the most cheerful hues could hide danger. For a nation obsessed with convenience and appearance, that was a bitter truth to swallow. Red candies without the familiar glow looked sadder, emptier, somehow less alive. But for many, the risk no longer seemed worth the shine. The ban left behind more than faded sweets. It left behind a lasting suspicion of anything too bright to be real. Potted meat spreads were once a survival food, tucked into lunchboxes and ration kits alike. Cheap, salty, and shelf-stable, they fed factory workers and families through tough times. But by the 1950s, the ingredients list started raising eyebrows, especially the preservatives. Borax, once used to keep the meat fresh, was found to be toxic in even small amounts. When the Food and Drug Administration cracked down, cans were pulled from stores, and a generation's comfort food was suddenly deemed dangerous. The smell of potted meat lingered in kitchens long after the last can disappeared. It was the end of an era when lasting forever was considered a virtue. The ban taught people that longevity did not always mean safety, and that the race for convenience came with hidden costs. For many, it was a small but haunting reminder that even survival foods could turn against you. Home-cured bacon was once the pride of farmhouse kitchens, salted, hung, and smoked with care. Families passed down curing recipes like heirlooms, believing that a bit of salt and thyme could preserve more than just meat. It could preserve self-sufficiency. But in the 1950s, science stepped in with a warning. Nitrates, long used in curing, might not be as harmless as they seemed. Studies found they could turn into carcinogenic compounds when heated, sparking one of the earliest food safety scares of the modern age. The government began regulating their use, and homemade bacon suddenly fell under suspicion. People were told to buy factory-sealed packages instead, stamped with federal approval and safety codes. For rural households, it felt like losing a piece of freedom. The smoky scent of bacon in the smokehouse became a relic, replaced by the sterile shine of refrigerated aisles. Once a symbol of self-reliance, home curing was now a risk too great to take. Shellfish cocktails from street vendors were the taste of coastal summer. Iced oysters and clams scooped into paper cups and doused with lemon and spice. They were cheap, lively and social, eaten standing up with friends under the sun. But as hepatitis outbreaks swept through seaside towns, health boards declared war on raw shellfish. Vendors were shut down, and beachside stalls were emptied overnight. Scientists blamed warm weather, poor storage, and lack of regulation. But for locals, it felt like losing a ritual. The ocean's bounty was now something to fear, not savor. People began boiling, frying, and sterilizing what they once ate fresh. Those carefree days of slurping briny cocktails from paper cups were gone, replaced by strict hygiene codes and refrigerated displays. Safety came at the cost of spontaneity. America's love for the sea stayed, but its trust in street-side seafood never recovered. Tinned sardines in cottonseed oil were once a cheap, portable miracle. They were packed into every pantry, lunchbox, and survival kit, an emblem of convenience before fast food even had a name. But as reports of rancid oils and contamination grew, trust in the humble tin began to rot too. The cottonseed oil, cheap and abundant, proved unstable under heat and storage. The fish took on strange flavors, and entire batches spoiled before they could be sold. When testing revealed toxins forming in the oil itself, the Food and Drug Administration stepped in. Imports were seized, and domestic producers quietly switched to safer oils like olive and soybean. For the first time, Americans began to question the safety of canned goods once seen as untouchable. The sardine, a war hero and working-class staple, suddenly became suspect. And as the tins vanished from shelves, so too did a little of the trust that had built the post-war convenience boom. Irradiated fruit was supposed to be the future. Government scientists promised longer shelf lives, fewer pests, and fresher produce for all. They beamed atomic rays through oranges and apples, calling it the miracle of modern preservation. But when newspapers began calling it nuclear food, the optimism curdled. The same technology that powered bombs was now being used on breakfast tables, and that frightened everyone. Housewives wrote letters to Congress demanding answers. Schools began banning irradiated fruit from cafeterias, and grocery stores quietly cleared their shelves. No matter how many officials said it was safe, people could not shake the image of glowing fruit sitting under the kitchen light. By the end of the decade, the program was halted completely. The fear was stronger than the science, and the atomic age of food ended before it ever truly began. Absinthe had already been banned in the United States for decades, but the 1950s brought its ghost back into the spotlight. The green liqueur, infamous in Europe for its supposed hallucinogenic powers, was condemned all over again. Post-war America wanted stability, morality, and clean living, and absinthe represented everything it feared: indulgence, madness, and foreign decadence. The wormwood used to make it was accused of driving drinkers insane, a myth the media was all too happy to revive. When European imports tried to sneak their way back into American bars, customs agents seized them like contraband. The ban was reaffirmed, and absinthe returned to the realm of legend. It was the outlaw drink of poets and painters, far too wild for a nation chasing suburban perfection. By the 1950s, absinthe's glow faded into myth, replaced by sanitized cocktails and American whiskeys. What had once symbolized artistic rebellion was now a relic of sins no one dared to repeat. Unpasteurized apple cider once defined autumn. It was the flavor of harvest festivals, sold in glass jugs that fogged with sweetness and memory. But as food safety laws tightened, the raw, unpasteurized kind came under fire. Cases of foodborne illness were traced back to small farms that lacked modern sanitation. It was not just a warning, it was a crackdown. Inspectors forced producers to pasteurize or stop selling altogether. The raw cider that once poured straight from the press into the bottle was now filtered, heated, and sterilized into submission. The taste changed, and so did the trust. Consumers were safer, but something simple was lost: the crisp tang of apples that still tasted like the orchard they came from. For many rural families, it marked the slow death of local flavor, replaced by corporate caution. Lead glazed ceramic cookware was once a kitchen treasure, bright, colorful, and imported from distant markets. Housewives displayed it proudly, unaware that each stew, soup, and sauce was quietly absorbing poison. When researchers discovered that the glazes leached lead into food, the shock spread fast. Imported pottery from Mexico, Italy, and even local artisans was pulled from stores. Families who had used the same pots for years were told to throw them away. It was a betrayal hidden in beauty, something meant to serve now seen as a silent killer. The government issued warnings, but for many, the damage was already done. The ban marked a turning point in how Americans thought about aesthetics and safety. A pot could be gorgeous and deadly at once. The message was clear. In the modern kitchen, trust had to be earned, not painted on. Fugu, the delicate Japanese pufferfish, had fascinated Americans since stories of its deadly potential reached their shores. The dish was exotic, forbidden, and thrilling. But in the 1950s, the government decided it was one risk too many. The toxin in fugu could stop a heart in minutes, and one wrong cut from a chef's knife meant disaster. The ban was absolute. Restaurants caught serving it faced heavy fines, and imports were confiscated before reaching ports. To the adventurous, it became a symbol of lost courage, a delicacy wrapped in danger that America simply could not trust. Yet its legend only grew. In post-war magazines, fugu was spoken of like a ghost of the East, deadly, beautiful, and untouchable. The ban was not just about safety, it was about fear of the unfamiliar. In trying to protect itself, America also closed its door to one of the world's most daring cuisines. Uninspected venison jerky was once a road trip snack and hunter's pride. Small towns and roadside stands sold it by the bag, made from deer hunted just a few miles away. But the 1950s ushered in a new era of federal oversight. The United States Department of Agriculture began cracking down on uninspected meats, demanding licenses and safety checks even for small operations. Hunters and local butchers cried foul, calling it an attack on tradition. Officials called it modernization. The truth lay somewhere in between. The ban on uninspected jerky was not just about hygiene, it was about control. Homemade dried meat, once a symbol of independence, was now considered illegal unless approved by the government. It marked the moment when food stopped being purely local and became part of a national system of trust or suspicion. Methyl alcohol in homemade vanilla extracts turned sweetness into poison. During the 1950s, with vanilla prices soaring, bootleg flavorings flooded markets and home kitchens alike. People mixed industrial-grade alcohol with vanilla beans, unaware that methyl alcohol was toxic. The result was tragedy: blindness, sickness, and even death. When authorities discovered the scale of the problem, they moved fast. Homemade extracts were confiscated and warnings plastered across newspapers. Families that had relied on their own recipes now feared their kitchens. The ban was swift and absolute. Methyl alcohol was outlawed in any food product. In its place came factory-sealed bottles stamped with purity labels. It was another sign of the times, home ingenuity giving way to industrial assurance. Vanilla, once the warm scent of comfort, now carried the cold shadow of caution. Unrefrigerated mayonnaise salads were the highlight of every summer picnic, creamy, tangy, and loaded with diced eggs, potatoes, or macaroni. But as the 1950s wore on, those same dishes turned from beloved to feared. Reports of salmonella poisoning began sweeping through cities, traced back to Sunny Park lunches and roadside gatherings. The culprit was simple: mayonnaise left sitting too long in the heat. Health campaigns flooded newspapers with warnings, urging families to keep their salads cold or not serve them at all. The era of carefree picnic spreads was over. Portable coolers were still rare, so the risk felt unavoidable. Churches canceled potlucks, and homemakers swapped creamy salads for vinegar-based slaws. It was a small change with a big cultural impact. The summer table lost some of its warmth, traded for safety and suspicion. What had once been a symbol of togetherness was now a headline about foodborne fear. Sulfur-treated dried fruit was once advertised as the future of snacking: bright, flavorful, and long-lasting. Housewives could keep apricots, apples, and prunes for months without spoilage. But soon, allergic reactions and asthma attacks began surfacing, especially in children. Doctors traced the problem to the sulfur dioxide used to preserve the fruit's color and shelf life. The Food and Drug Administration moved quickly, tightening restrictions and forcing producers to label sulfur-treated goods. The cheerful glow of golden apricots faded into something unsettling, a reminder that the prettiest foods were not always the safest. Families returned to canning or buying darker, untreated fruit, even if it looked less appealing. This was the start of a broader mistrust toward chemical additives, the kind that would define food culture for decades to come. In the name of convenience, something pure had been lost. Imported French soft cheeses like Brie and Camembert were once luxuries reserved for the curious and the cultured. Their rich aroma and creamy texture symbolized sophistication in post-war America. But that very richness became their downfall. Because these cheeses were made with unpasteurized milk, they fell under strict import bans during the 1950s. Health authorities warned that they could carry bacteria like Listeria or Brucella, posing unseen dangers to expectant mothers and infants. Gourmet shops were forced to remove them, and travelers returning from Europe had their cheeses confiscated at customs. The crackdown drew a line between romance and risk. For many Americans, it was their first taste of global regulation, where culture met caution at the border. Pasteurized versions arrived soon after, but connoisseurs swore they never tasted the same. A creamy dream had been sterilized into submission. Canned baby food with lead-soldered lids was a quiet tragedy. For years, parents trusted those neat little jars filled with mashed peas and carrots, believing them to be the safest meals a child could eat. Then scientists discovered that the solder sealing the cans leached lead into the food. Exposure built up slowly, harming development and cognition. The public outcry was swift and devastating. Manufacturers were forced to recall entire product lines, and new regulations banned lead in all food packaging. It was one of the earliest lessons in how industrial shortcuts could endanger the most innocent consumers. Parents who once felt pride in modern convenience now felt guilt every time they opened a jar. The reform saved lives, but it also shattered trust. The gleaming promise of post-war food technology was no longer something to celebrate. It was something to question. Food coloring in pickles and relishes once made the simplest foods sparkle like gemstones. Bright greens, yellows, and reds filled every grocery shelf, their glass jars gleaming like carnival lights under fluorescent store bulbs. Housewives loved the illusion, freshness sealed tight months or even years after bottling. But curiosity soon turned to suspicion. How could something trapped in a jar still shine like it had just come from the garden? When scientists began linking synthetic dyes to hyperactivity and chemical toxicity, the glow lost its innocence. The Food and Drug Administration stepped in, and the so-called radioactive brights vanished almost overnight. Natural colors returned, but the visual magic disappeared. The duller tones felt safer, but also strangely sad, like the lights had dimmed in the nation's pantry. For the first time, Americans began questioning the idea of perfection on their plates. Beauty, it seemed, could be dangerous. Pickles that once glistened with impossible vibrance now sat honest and humble in their jars, pale but pure. It was the beginning of a quiet reckoning with artifice itself. The fluorescent kitchen lost its shine, and the age of artificial confidence gave way to something plainer. Truth in a jar, even if it looked a little less appetizing. Tinned pineapple was once the taste of paradise in post-war America, a can of sunshine, promising escape from gray winters and rationed years. Housewives opened them for cakes, salads, and family desserts, the syrupy scent filling kitchens with tropical fantasy. But whispers began to spread that some factories were using formaldehyde to preserve the fruit's color and texture. The idea horrified the public. A chemical used for embalming had no place in something so sweet. When investigations proved the rumors true in overseas plants, the backlash was swift and merciless. Imports were banned, and brands raced to distance themselves from the scandal. Advertisements shifted tone, emphasizing purity, safety, and American production. But the trust had already curdled. What had once symbolized innocence and modern convenience now tasted of deception. The Food and Drug Administration outlawed the practice entirely, yet the damage lingered. Housewives began reading labels with suspicion, and the word preservative lost its comforting tone. Tinned pineapple still glistened in syrup, but its glow now carried a warning. The sweetness of the modern kitchen had revealed its hidden cost, a price paid not in money, but in faith. Shark fin soup was once a dish of quiet prestige, served in coastal hotels and upscale restaurants as an imported wonder. It arrived steaming in porcelain bowls, promising refinement and worldliness to diners eager to taste the exotic. But by the 1950s, the government began pulling it from menus. Tests showed high levels of mercury and heavy metals in imported shark fins, while early conservation voices warned of vanishing shark populations. Chefs removed it quietly, sensing the tide turning. What had once represented adventure and global sophistication now carried an uneasy aftertaste of exploitation. The dish became a symbol of guilt rather than glamour. Diners who once sought novelty turned inward, preferring safer, familiar comforts to foreign risks. It was more than a menu change. It was a mirror reflecting a nation's shifting conscience. In chasing progress, America had learned to fear what it could not control. The disappearance of shark fin soup marked a subtle but lasting shift in taste, one that favored morality over indulgence, safety over spectacle. For the first time, luxury itself felt suspicious, and curiosity came with consequences. The bowl went cold, and an era of reckless appetite quietly ended. Homemade ice cream was once the heartbeat of weekend joy, spun slowly in metal churners, while kids took turns cranking the handle. It was creamy, cold, and made with love. Milk, sugar, cream, and the occasional splash of vanilla stolen from the pantry. But when home cooks began cracking raw eggs into the mix to make it richer, they unknowingly opened the door to something invisible and dangerous. By the 1950s, Salmonella had become a household name, whispered in fear through neighborhoods and health reports. Public health bulletins warned that even one bad egg could ruin not just dessert, but a family's safety. The government stepped in, urging Americans to pasteurize or simply stop making it at home. Ice cream parlors adapted fast, using factory-tested ingredients that promised consistency and cleanliness. But what was gained in safety came at the expense of magic. The slow rhythm of hand churning, the laughter echoing in backyards, and the first taste from the wooden spoon all began to fade. Store-bought tubs took their place, efficient, sterile, and heartbreakingly predictable. Safety had won the war, but spontaneity and memory were its quiet casualties. A generation raised on backyard sweetness now opened freezers instead of stories. Cough syrups once came in glass bottles that blurred the line between medicine and indulgence. They promised healing in every sweet, syrupy sip, laced with herbs, alcohol, and sometimes narcotics strong enough to numb both pain and panic. Families poured spoonfuls without question, trusting the label's fancy script that spoke of miracles, tonics, and vitality. Companies marketed them as refreshments too, with posters showing cheerful children and mothers smiling beside slogans like "a daily dose of delight." Brands such as Dr. Pepper began in that very space where the pharmacy met the soda fountain. But by the 1950s, the Food and Drug Administration drew a hard line. Any drink claiming medical benefits had to prove them with science. Overnight, the cure-all tonics became simple soft drinks, stripped of their medicinal mystique. Ads changed from health promises to happiness pitches. The transformation was as cultural as it was regulatory. Americans learned that not every comfort could be trusted, and not every label told the truth. The modern soda industry was born, bright and bubbly, but with its conscience scrubbed clean. The medicine cabinet and the soda counter finally parted ways. Radiation-exposed milk became one of the most haunting stories of post-war America. After nuclear testing in the deserts of Nevada, invisible dust settled across the grazing fields where cows fed. At first, no one noticed. Then came reports that radioactive isotopes had made their way into the milk supply, reaching dinner tables across the nation. Families had been unknowingly drinking fallout. When scientists confirmed the findings, fear spread faster than any warning could. The government rushed to calm the chaos with recalls and promises of new safety programs, but reassurance came too late. Milk, once the very emblem of purity, nourishment, and childhood innocence, was now tainted by the atomic age. Mothers wept as they poured it down drains, unsure what could be trusted anymore. The glass of milk that once symbolized growth and comfort had become a symbol of contamination and doubt. The crisis exposed something far deeper than a health hazard. It revealed how modern progress could turn on itself. In trying to build a powerful future, America had accidentally poisoned its most sacred staple. From that moment on, every drop carried not just calcium and vitamins, but the lingering taste of fear. In the humid summers of the South and Midwest during the Depression, resourceful cooks dipped ladles into bubbling pots filled with a delicacy now hidden behind a shield of wildlife protections: wild turtle soup made from snapping turtles. Highly regarded for its supposed medicinal properties, this dish combined turtle meat with vegetables and spices in a slow-cooked broth, sometimes enriched with sherry, giving it a sophisticated flair despite its humble swamp origins. Catching snapping turtles required skill and caution. These prehistoric-looking creatures packed jaws powerful enough to snap broom handles, making dinner prep almost as dangerous as it was economical. Cookbooks of the era suggested that turtle meat contained 7 distinct flavors, though skeptical diners joked it tasted mostly like swamp chicken. Overhunting and declining populations eventually forced state governments to step in, enacting strict laws and bans protecting snapping turtles from commercial harvest. Today, turtle trapping is highly regulated or illegal altogether in several states, particularly where species are considered endangered or threatened. Canned tuna was cheap, packed with protein, and could be turned into everything from tuna salad sandwiches to casseroles. Families relied on it for quick meals, and no one thought twice about how much they ate. Back then, there were no warning labels, no recommendations to limit consumption, just endless recipes encouraging people to make the most of their pantry supply. But there was a hidden problem. Industrial pollution had been steadily increasing mercury levels in ocean fish, and tuna, being a top predator, was absorbing more than its fair share. By 1970, reports surfaced linking mercury in tuna to potential neurological damage, particularly in pregnant women and young children. The FDA took action, setting limits on mercury levels in fish, but there was no official warning on cans. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the government issued clear guidelines advising consumers, especially expectant mothers, to limit their intake of certain tuna varieties. Despite the concerns, canned tuna never disappeared from store shelves. It's still a go-to meal for millions, but with a little more caution attached. So, you're all familiar with the way Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, right? Well, in the 1950s, that stopped being a thing, at least on paper. It did, however, still have the coca leaf extract. The very earliest Coca-Cola recipes from the 1880s had small amounts of cocaine from coca leaves, and back then it was pretty common. By 1904, though, amidst growing substance abuse concerns, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was passed, making cocaine officially illegal. By the 50s, the drink was stimulant-free, but cocaine comes from those leaves and the extract they're still using, so what gives? Well, this was a little technical and legal loophole. The Stepan Company was one company that operated during this time and had a nice arrangement with the United States government. It was given the right to import coca leaves, albeit under government supervision, and only as long as all traces of cocaine were extracted. These drained leaves would then be used as a flavoring. This agreement and this company still stand today, and the agreement was even reinforced in 1986. Plus, they had to spend an incredible amount of effort and time rebranding Coca-Cola's image. By the 50s, people hadn't forgotten its powdery past, but they were starting to. That's how it's turned into the mainstream family drink you have in your refrigerator today. When food budgets shrank dramatically in Depression-era America, backyard creatures found themselves promoted from pests to pot roast. Among these unlikely dinner guests was the humble opossum, famously cooked into dishes such as opossum pot roast. Preparation involved meticulous attention, first soaking the meat overnight in salted water, then carefully removing excess fat before slowly roasting alongside sweet potatoes, onions, carrots, and apples. Cookbooks from that time proudly featured detailed opossum recipes, reassuring skeptical home chefs that the meat was tender, mild-flavored, and almost as good as pork, though likely no opossum ever felt flattered by the comparison. Historically significant in southern states, the opossum was even humorously honored at community possum suppers, where neighbors gathered, possibly wondering if dinner had recently visited their own porch. However, modern dining etiquette and strict wildlife regulations have largely removed opossum from American menus. Health officials today strongly advise against eating opossums due to risks of diseases like leptospirosis and parasites unaffected by standard cooking temperatures. Many states now regulate or ban trapping and consumption of these marsupials altogether, highlighting safety concerns over nostalgia. In the Midwest, especially around Wisconsin, there was a holiday tradition that might make modern food safety inspectors break into a cold sweat. Raw ground beef served on rye bread, often topped with onions and a dash of salt and pepper. Known as cannibal sandwiches, this dish wasn't some underground delicacy. It was a staple at family gatherings, particularly around Christmas, when butchers sold the freshest beef and people trusted their local meat markets to provide high-quality, bacteria-free cuts. Eating raw meat might sound risky today, but for decades, it was considered perfectly normal in certain communities. The preparation was simple. Freshly ground beef, preferably from a trusted butcher, was spread onto slices of rye bread, sometimes with a smear of butter or mustard. Some enjoyed it with a side of pickles, others with a cold beer. To those who grew up with it, the taste was rich, the texture smooth, and the risk? Barely a thought. That changed as foodborne illnesses became a growing concern. By the late 20th century, increased cases of E. coli and Salmonella made raw beef a serious health hazard. The 1950s didn't just see the rise of raw milk, they were also a hotspot for trans fat-based cooking. It became something of a staple in processed foods for a few reasons. They had first been introduced through partially hydrogenated vegetable oils, which was this pretty new patented process that emerged in the 20th century. Basically, the idea was to turn oils from vegetables into these semi-solid fats that you could cook. If this science-y mambo-jumbo is going over your head, and trust me, it went over mine, you might better know this process as the wonderful works of Crisco. It's actually a cornerstone of their entire process. The concept itself has its roots in World War II-era rationing, and when lard and butter were completely out of supply, hydrogenated oils were a pretty neat alternative. Over time, companies realized they're also significantly cheaper and easier to work with too. From there on, making the switch was pretty much a sealed deal. They even put in the work marketing it as a healthier alternative to cook with, especially since cholesterol studies were making everyone rethink their relationship with McDonald's. Trans fats aren't actually any healthier than natural fats, but they are definitely a lot easier to mass produce, so there you go. In an era when practicality trumped sentimentality, even the family pet wasn't always off limits as a main course. Pet rabbits for meat became common during the Great Depression, as families raised them not just for fluffy companionship, but also as a convenient dinner solution. Surprisingly tender and mild-tasting, rabbit meat was commonly fried, stewed, or baked into pies after soaking overnight in buttermilk or vinegar to reduce gamminess. Because nothing ruins a Depression-era Sunday dinner quite like unwanted backyard flavor. Raising rabbits was uniquely economical, as these fluffy companions conveniently doubled as livestock, feeding on grass and garden scraps and multiplying at legendary speeds. There's a reason we still joke about rabbits' reproductive enthusiasm today. However, attitudes toward rabbits changed dramatically in post-war America. As people increasingly viewed these long-eared animals strictly as cuddly household companions rather than dinner options, cultural taboos strengthened significantly. Modern urban zoning regulations often explicitly forbid slaughtering animals considered pets, making it not just socially questionable but legally risky to prepare rabbit dinners at home in populated areas. By the 1970s, the diet food industry was booming. With calorie counting in full swing, people were looking for ways to satisfy their sweet tooth without the guilt. Saccharin became the answer. Found in everything from diet sodas to sugar-free desserts, it was a game changer. Hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, yet with none of the calories. It didn't taste exactly like sugar, but for those determined to stay slim, it was close enough. Saccharin had actually been around since the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it took over the diet market. People stirred it into their coffee, poured it over cereal, and downed it in soft drinks like Tab. It was everywhere, until scientists started raising concerns. In the early 1970s, studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, setting off alarm bells. The FDA responded by mandating warning labels on products containing the sweetener, effectively scaring off a lot of consumers. Despite the controversy, saccharin never fully disappeared. Later research suggested the rat studies didn't translate directly to humans, and by 2000, the cancer warning was removed. Today, it's still around, though it competes with newer artificial sweeteners. Back then, though, it was the diet craze's best friend. Until it wasn't. Now, sassafras tea was a beverage that most people had considered a very old tradition. Despite that, you may have never heard of it. This was something you would most commonly see in the Appalachian regions and the rural South. Native Americans were the first ones to ever introduce the settlers to the plant, and it was a very popular folk medicine. A lot of Native Americans put a lot of stock in its fever-managing, blood-purifying qualities. Back then, fevers were just about as common as zits, so having handy little herbal remedies was a godsend. It was really cheap, it was always available, even in grocery stores and medicine shops, and it was very easy to make. You could get dried sassafras root and that was it. You might be surprised that people often had it with root beer though. A pint of Hires or A&W along with your tried and tested root remedy was actually a pretty common pairing for people. Plus, traditional root beer recipes were made with sassafras, so that's also why it went together really well. It wasn't until studies found out that sassafras contained safrole in it, which is pretty harmful to your liver. A crisp autumn day in the 1970s wasn't complete without a trip to the local farm stand. Fresh apples, homemade pies, and of course, a jug of unpasteurized apple cider, cloudy, rich, and straight from the press. It was a seasonal tradition, the kind of drink you poured into a glass and sipped cold, or warmed up on the stove with a cinnamon stick. No labels, no expiration dates, just fresh pressed fruit in its purest form. For generations, farm-fresh juices were a staple, especially in rural areas where people trusted their local orchards. The juice was made by simply crushing fruit and collecting the liquid. No heat treatment, no extra processing, and because it wasn't filtered, it had that distinct, pulpy texture that store-bought juice just couldn't match. But as food safety research advanced, so did concerns over harmful bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. Unpasteurized juice, while natural, carried risks, especially for children and the elderly. By the 1990s, regulations tightened, requiring warning labels and, in many cases, pasteurization for commercial sale. While you can still find raw cider at some farm stands, it often comes with a disclaimer. When empty stomachs growled louder than consciences, desperate Depression-era families sometimes turned to stealing eggs from wild bird nests, transforming survival into a risky game of climbing trees and dodging angry mother birds. Children often undertook this daring pantry raid, carefully selecting nests perched high above the ground, collecting delicate eggs from robins, sparrows, or doves. These tiny eggs were either scrambled or fried, occasionally mixed into baked goods or cooked into miniature omelets, providing valuable protein at virtually no cost, except perhaps the occasional scratch or angry peck. Cookbooks didn't endorse nest raiding outright, but folklore and family recipes quietly suggested the eggs tasted richer and creamier than typical store-bought versions, perhaps flavored by adrenaline from evading dive-bombing parents. However, what began as a necessary measure evolved into a serious ecological threat as declining bird populations led to stringent protections. Under today's strict wildlife conservation laws, specifically the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, stealing wild eggs is explicitly illegal, punishable by substantial fines or even imprisonment. In the 1970s, grabbing a snack off the grocery shelf was simple. No long ingredient lists, no allergy warnings, just food in a package. If a product contained peanuts, dairy, or wheat, it was up to the consumer to figure it out. Those with food allergies had to play detective, carefully reading labels, if they even listed all the ingredients. There were no bold warnings, no may contain statements, and certainly no standardized regulations to prevent cross-contamination. Food manufacturers weren't trying to be careless. The awareness just wasn't there. While allergies existed, they weren't as widely recognized as they are today. A peanut butter factory might also process cookies, but there was no obligation to disclose that. For those with severe allergies, eating processed food could be a game of Russian roulette. One mislabeled snack, and a hospital trip wasn't out of the question. The turning point came in the late 1990s and early 2000s when food allergy cases became more widely studied, and advocacy groups pushed for better labeling. In 2004, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act was passed, requiring clear identification of the top 8 allergens. So, what if I told you people actually ate monkey brains in the 50s back then? I think given the state of the rest of this list, you would probably be inclined to believe me too. But don't worry, dear viewer, I'm not going to traumatize you with elaborate descriptions of monkey minds. This was mostly just an unverified folk myth that got really popular for a few reasons. Generational discontent with the uber-wealthy, popular myths about Chinese cuisines, and a lot of over-the-top elaborate fictional propaganda by Hollywood films. I don't mean actual propaganda, but some films might have spread the idea that monkey brains were actually consumed, when that couldn't be further from the truth. The Temple of Doom and the original Indiana Jones were still really good movies, though. Don't let odd scenes with monkey brains for dessert turn you off from that. If we actually look at the facts, though, no one can really find any historical evidence for monkey brains being a solidified culinary moment in American cuisine. There would at least be super niche references to a dish if it was underground, a part of a specific culture or some kind of phenomena only in specific culinary circles, But nope, nothing comes up for monkey brains, and I thank God for that. Before neatly packaged pork chops arrived wrapped in cellophane at supermarkets, families in Depression-era America took matters and meat cleavers into their own hands. Home-slaughtered pigs without inspection weren't just rural tradition, they were economic necessity, a direct route from the backyard pig pen to dinner plates nationwide. Neighbors often gathered together, turning butchering day into a social event, perhaps the original farm-to-table movement, minus the trendy menus. Pork cuts were carefully salted, smoked, cured, or canned in cellars without official oversight, and sausages stuffed by hand provided protein all winter. Interestingly, nearly every part found a use, including rendering fat for lard or transforming scraps into sausage, a testament to Depression-era thriftiness. Yet these home-slaughtered practices carried hidden dangers. Unsupervised slaughter led to contamination risks, including trichinosis outbreaks and food poisoning incidents that pushed authorities toward regulation. Today, selling home-slaughtered pork without USDA inspection isn't just risky. It's illegal nationwide, intended to protect public health and ensure humane animal treatment standards. In the 1970s, home canning was more than just a hobby. It was a way to stretch the grocery budget and keep the pantry stocked year-round. Families filled their shelves with jars of green beans, corn, and carrots, all preserved with time-tested methods passed down through generations. But while fruits and jams could be safely canned with a boiling water bath, low-acid vegetables were another story. Without a pressure cooker, those innocent-looking jars could turn into ticking time bombs for botulism. For years, many home canners relied on boiling water alone, believing that if it sealed, it was safe. Some added aspirin or vinegar, thinking it would help ward off bacteria. Others simply trusted the process. After all, their grandparents had done it. The problem? Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria behind botulism, thrives in low oxygen, low-acid environments like improperly canned vegetables. It doesn't change the taste, smell, or appearance of food, making it nearly impossible to detect until symptoms appear. As cases of botulism poisoning mounted, food safety officials began cracking down, emphasizing the need for pressure canning. You know what the 1950s were also about? Food experimenting, and I mean in more ways than one. If you thought putting turtles in your soup was pushing the boundaries, then wait till you hear about putting shark fin in it instead. That's right, shark fin soup was definitely a niche interest of a lot of communities in America at the time. From Chinatowns in big urban hubs like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco to Chinese banquet halls that really emphasized authentic, faithful traditional dishes. It was a time where everyone was buying into the craze, and I mean this is the same generation that grew up with Coke in their Coke. Shark fin soup didn't last long in the mainstream, and in fact, it didn't really get there either. A lot of those issues stemmed from costs. Shark fins were always imported, and they were very expensive to source. Outside of a Chinese-Japanese audience, there just wasn't an audience that could really appreciate it or have consistent demand for it. As fancy as it was, and believe me, while it was niche, it was definitely a status symbol. There just wasn't enough practicality. During the hardest years of the Great Depression, desperate hunger led Americans to pursue protein sources that nowadays would make your local health inspector faint, like bat meat. Although bats weren't common dinner fare, isolated accounts from this challenging era document people trapping and roasting these nocturnal creatures, usually out of sheer necessity rather than culinary curiosity. Preparation involved singeing the fur off bats, an image probably best left to history books, and roasting or boiling the meat thoroughly to combat its intensely gamey taste. Some Depression-era home chefs optimistically suggested marinating bat meat overnight, perhaps hoping to mask flavors described politely as unusually pungent. Humorously, no cookbook of the era prominently advertised bat recipes, suggesting even desperate cooks preferred to keep bat suppers under wraps. Today, however, American laws explicitly forbid hunting or consuming bats, recognizing their critical role in ecosystems as insect controllers and pollinators. Additionally, bats carry diseases like rabies and histoplasmosis, making their consumption extremely dangerous and firmly illegal. For much of the 20th century, canned foods were a kitchen essential. They were cheap, convenient, and had an impressively long shelf life. Whether it was a can of soup, vegetables, or condensed milk, chances were high that the can itself was sealed with lead solder. It seemed like a practical solution at the time. Lead was easy to work with, and it created a strong, airtight seal that kept food from spoiling. But what people didn't realize was that the lead in those seams wasn't just staying on the outside. Over time, especially with acidic foods like tomatoes or fruit, the lead could leach into the food. And unlike a bad ingredient you can taste or smell, lead poisoning happens slowly. Symptoms could take years to appear, affecting the nervous system, brain function, and even childhood development. The real turning point came in the 1970s, when health experts made the undeniable link between lead exposure and serious health risks. By 1991, lead-soldered food cans were completely banned in the US, replaced with safer manufacturing methods. While today's cans are lead-free, the lesson stuck. Sometimes the biggest dangers aren't the ones you can see. Opium-based tonics were actually a lot more common than you would think. Tonics used to have morphine, codeine, and opium in them, and in pretty jarring amounts. You would think people would have learned their lesson from Absinthe, but at least that was just paranoia at work. Opium actually is pretty addictive and has some incredible potential for long-term damage once the damage is done. We talked a little about the Harrison Narcotics Act, and it is relevant here too. It was only after tighter regulations finally made a dent in the supply of opium that the government started having a grip on it. Before that, it was pretty much the most common drug you could get for yourself throughout the entire country. People bought it for relaxation, pain relief, cough suppression, and a lot more. Maybe it just made them feel good, but people seemed to definitely think that they found a miracle tonic, even though they didn't. Even after it was banned, illegal supply systems and smugglers would still keep opium sales active throughout the 50s, especially in underground markets. Preserving meat was crucial when refrigeration wasn't an option, so Depression-era families turned to unpasteurized home-canned meats, a kitchen practice that involved cooking meat cuts, placing them in reused glass jars, then sealing tightly with wax or rudimentary lids. Housewives proudly displayed pantry shelves stocked with jars filled with pork, beef, or chicken, simmered simply in their own juices, offering a reliable meal source during the harshest months. Although economical, this preservation method was essentially playing culinary roulette. Without pressure cookers, botulism thrived unseen, sometimes delivering more than families bargained for at dinner. After all, homemade pickles were tasty, paralysis not so much. In fact, botulism outbreaks from improperly canned meats contributed significantly to the establishment of strict federal regulations mandating pressure canning and pasteurization to safeguard consumers. By mid-century, labels, expiration dates, and government oversight replaced wax seals and guesswork, legally forbidding unpasteurized home-canned meats from commercial sale and strongly discouraging them domestically. By the 1970s, margarine had secured its place as the healthier alternative to butter. It was cheaper, lasted longer, and, thanks to trans fats, stayed solid at room temperature while giving baked goods that perfect flakiness. Fast food chains and restaurants took full advantage, using partially hydrogenated oils for frying everything from French fries to fried chicken. The result? Crispy, golden perfection with a long shelf life. But what seemed like a miracle ingredient turned out to be a silent killer. Trans fats raised bad cholesterol, lowered good cholesterol, and increased the risk of heart disease, without people even realizing it. For decades, the food industry brushed off concerns, marketing margarine as a healthier alternative while deep fryers across America sizzled with heart-clogging oils. The science was catching up, though, and by the early 2000s, studies confirmed what researchers had suspected for years. Trans fats were among the worst fats you could consume. Regulations followed, and by 2015, the FDA officially declared trans fats unsafe. Companies scrambled to reformulate products, and today, margarine isn't what it used to be. While fried food never went out of style, the days of trans fat-loaded cooking oils are over. Red dye number 2, or otherwise known as amaranth, was actually one of the most popular artificial food colorings ever produced. If you ever had candy, soda, processed meat, hell, if you bought certain kinds of makeup, there were high chances this was either on your skin or in your system. Now, normally, people didn't care too much about it. I mean, it's the 50s, that's kind of on brand for the time period, right? And why would they? It was resistant to heat, it could be used in liquid form and powder, it was a lot cheaper, easy to produce in bulk, it could be used with everything, and the color was just spectacular. So some of you might immediately express a lot of enthusiasm after hearing that. But some of you might think, what's the catch? Raise a suspicious eyebrow, or just think that this is too good to be true. And you'd be exactly right. The Food and Drugs Administration outlawed amaranth in around 1976 because studies had suggested that it actually increased the chances of cancer. Scientists had begun to link potential carcinogenic effects, and amaranth in particular came under scrutiny. There were all sorts of rumors about it. From your head to your toes, it could give you tumors anywhere like mosquitoes give you rashes. This pretty much sealed the deal for the industry, and as they wanted to get ahead of the issue, the ban became a pretty clear solution. If you remember hearing about any of these banned foods, comment your favorite bite, hit like, and subscribe to keep these lost flavors from fading away.